Okay, hi everybody. Thank you all for being here, for those in person and for those joining us online and for those who will be joining us later. The title of this conference, as you all know, is Seeing the World Through Sudan, Critical Frameworks for Understanding the Crises and Implications of Sudan's Counter-Revolutionary Wars. Before I begin introducing the panels and our brilliant panelists, I just wanted to get a few housekeeping items out of the way. The first and probably the most important is that the bathroom is right outside to the right. And the overflow room for when this room gets crowded is right downstairs in room 256 in the South Common Room. The third thing is we have two of our panelists will be joining us virtually over Zoom. And the audio in this room is very low for the people speaking via Zoom. So when people are joining us or speaking via Zoom, please just be mindful to be quiet so we can hear them all. So I want to start by grounding this conference in the reality and the devastation of war that it confronts. Sudan is currently the largest displacement crisis in the world. At least 80% of hospitals and health facilities in Sudan are unusable. 15 million people are without critical health care. And both warring parties and the militarized groups, civilian and non-civilian, have made deliberate strikes on civilian infrastructure and have contributed to the rampant forms of violence that target Sudan's most vulnerable communities, women and girls, internally displaced peoples, and indigenous groups from Sudan's most resource-rich lands. Genocide and famine have devastated the entirety of the country, particularly North Darfur. But as I say this, I remember all the times these statistics have been stated before, how many times they have been repeated, and I wonder how many times we will have to repeat them until the intricacies and the implications of the counter-revolutionary war currently taking place in Sudan are interrogated by the rest of the world. All of our speakers here today, Dr. Nisrin Elamin, Kholood Khair, Yassmin Abdel-Magied, Hamid Ahmed, Hamid Khalafallah, Jawhratelkmal Kanu, Ibrahim Al-Hajj and Mus'ab Baba, who's not here yet, who will be joining us tomorrow, have all played a critical role in elevating the narrative about Sudan to a more critical place that takes it away from the binary frameworks that have troubled it for decades. But of course, this group of people is not exhaustive, and there are many brilliant intellectuals, thinkers, particularly Sudanese women and feminists who have all contributed to the struggle of helping us understand Sudan better and helping the world understand Sudan with more depth and complexity. And so whether, in reference to the binary frameworks that have troubled to Sudan, which I just mentioned, these include the Arab, African, Muslim, Christian, North-South, RSF, SAF binary that has sort of plagued Sudan's history in the past few decades, if not since Sudan's inception. So all of these false dilemmas, as Kholood so aptly called it in her article cited in the reading list, ignore the world-making alternatives that are embedded in the social and political fabric of the emergency response rooms, neighborhood resistance committees, and mutual aid networks supporting communities in Sudan before and after the war. This conference builds upon and is inspired by the efforts of Sudanese people that have upheld and preserved our historical and political traditions. We cannot ignore the fact that we are holding this conference in the face of an ongoing war that has killed an estimated of 150,000 people, this being a likely underestimation. We are also in a moment where the warring parties and their respective ideological machines are competing to rewrite our recent and distant histories, making up fictions about the 2018 revolution and the relationship of the so-called periphery to the center of Khartoum. This is an attempt to disguise the fact that the core of violence in Sudan begins at the historical military state. As we'll discuss in the panels on land and revolution and counter-revolution, the proliferation of violence involves political actors both in and outside of Sudan, and these are connected processes. Since even before Sudan's independence, the military state has externalized its own legitimacy to local militarized groups who could subdue regions far away from the riverine center while ignoring the rights and claims of indigenous peoples in Sudan. This encouraged the militarization of different racialized groups in Darfur, particularly after the Sudanese state's genocide of Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa communities between 2003 and 2005, a process in which the Rapid Support Forces, formerly known as the Janjaweed, emerged and grew to compete over the same monopoly of violence with the institution from which it emerged, the Sudanese Armed Forces. This allowed the state to better organize and control the rural militias that maintained Sudan's austerity-driven systems of consumption and production. The Sudanese government, seeking to maximize their profits from the early 2000s oil boom, increasingly privatized agricultural lands. The Gulf states, but specifically Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, leased millions of acres of land at a time from the Sudanese government for a period of 99 years. Landowners and farmers were systematically and violently dispossessed from their land, and farmers' cooperatives and unions were dissolved by the government. These simultaneous processes both neoliberalized the economy through the institutionalization of extractive economic networks across the region, and also deprived farmers who directly challenged the state's authority and claimed to monopolize the land and the labor of those who toil it. As Dr. Elamin, Sarah Abbas, Rabab al-Naim, and Abdul Rauf Umar discuss in great depth in their article in Hammer and Hope, cited on the reading list, land justice has always been central to the struggle to live, and in states such as Sudan, the choice to live, to survive, and to persist in struggle is a revolutionary one. So we will conclude the first day of panels with a discussion on global solidarity. We will discuss both the limitations and possibilities of it and collectively think through practical approaches that frame revolutionary struggles, such as the one taking place in Sudan, in the context of crises occurring in both regional and global hegemonies. This is an approach that names the ties that bind global regimes of violence to one another. On that note, we cannot continue without openly acknowledging the fact that this conference is taking place at an institution and corporation which has just recently decided to continue investing in Israel's genocide of Palestinians and the endless and inhumane imperial endeavors in the broader region. I hope to use this space as one where we can critically confront the contradictions we all exist in. This conference is driven by this goal and the ultimate goal of documenting and learning from the history of revolutionary and counter-revolutionary struggle in Sudan. I want to thank my co-conveners, Jawhratelkmal Kanu and Jordan Moki, for their hard work and commitment to realizing this project, and to Daniel Smith and Kristen Kilgis from the Watson Institute here at Brown for their generosity, continued support over these last few months to put this together. I want to thank the Africa Initiative at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, the Brown Arts Institute, the Coates Institute for the Humanities, Literary Arts, the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women, the Department of Africana Studies, the Department of Modern Cultural Media, and the Department of Comparative Literature, and Sudan Human Rights Hub for their support of this conference. Without further ado, I would like to begin the conference by asking each of our brilliant panelists to introduce themselves by answering the following question. And we can just go around. We'll go with Nisrin, Kholood, Yassmin, and then we'll go to Hamid and Jawhara. The question being, why does your work demand a complex, dynamic, and sometimes contradictory analysis of the counter-revolutionary war in Sudan?
So first of all, I just want to thank you all for being here. And I want to thank Jordan, Luvuyo, and Bayan for organizing this. I can only imagine the kind of both intellectual and other kinds of labor that went into convening us all. And it's really quite tremendous, like what you've done. I really appreciate it. And thank you for including me. Okay, so I always like to say that I'm not Alex DeWall, so I can't like just speak off the cuff. So I have notes, so just bear with me, please. I am, what am I? I teach at the University of Toronto, anthropology and African studies. I'm also a member of the Sudan Solidarity Collective, which provides material support to kind of grassroots civil society formations on the ground. And we do some organizing around immigration. Okay, and stop me if I go over, but I consider myself a kind of naive student of the Sudans. As a scholar and reluctant academic, I'm constantly reminded of how little I know, of the gaps in my knowledge, and therefore of my own limitations in offering analysis on the current war. That said, I do know that history provides not only context for this war, but that history is really the necessary framework of analysis for understanding it and for situating it within a long history of state violence that began not with the former regime, but with the very formation of the Sudanese state in the 1950s. In a way, the counter-revolution has been decades in its unfolding. I also know that although we've had a very long history of state violence, repression, and systemic marginalization of vast areas of Sudan, and of course, something like 6 successful military coups, some of which lasted for 30 years, we've also had a very long history of popular resistance against the state and that even that historiography tends to center or elevate particular forms of resistance and a particular history of revolution over others. The historiography of this resistance tends to center, for instance, around urban revolutions which overthrew military dictators. Sudan's December Revolution is often compared to the 1964 revolution, sparked by clashes between students convening a symposium on the question of South Sudanese autonomy and police at the University of Khartoum, that toppled Aboud's military regime, or to the 1985 Intifada triggered by US and IMF recommended austerity measures that overthrew Numeri. But I think it's important to trace the genealogy of the December Revolution back to the 1950s to demonstrate that the demands or challenge brought against the Sudanese state at that time, when it was first forming, are still very relevant. Britain's parting gift to Sudan at independence in 1956 was an economy dependent on the extraction of cash crops like cotton and a political system which was reconfigured to serve the interests of a northern and central Sudanese, Nubian and Arab identified elite. Both systems developed at the expense of the masses in the south and other marginalized regions, but also of a rural population at the center who helped to sustain this extractive export-oriented economy. As an example, the British vacated 800 administrative seats at independence, civil servants, agricultural scheme managers, top army and police officials, of which Sudan's new ruling elite allocated 6 to South Sudan, an area the size of Texas with a population of over 2.5 million. The remaining 790 plus seats were primarily occupied by riverine elites from the north and center. And this Sudanization process, as it was called, facilitated and enshrined the ongoing systemic marginalization of other regions such as Darfur, Eastern Sudan, Kordofan, and the Blue Nile region. Some of the initial forms of resistance against the new post-colonial state came from tenant farmers, who organized to demand, among other things, a greater share of profits as world cotton prices plummeted. A strike took place on a cotton scheme near Kosi shortly after independence, and the state responded with extreme violence. 300 striking tenant farmers were shot or suffocated in poorly ventilated detention cells. A year earlier, Sudan's first civil war had broken out between South Sudanese demanding political representation, equitable resource distribution, and regional autonomy, and the central government, who had essentially subsumed the South as a quasi-internal colony. In August of 1955, South Sudanese members of the Sudan Defense Forces Equatorial Corps mutinied in the southern town of Torit. This Torit mutiny was partly inspired by the Sudanization process led by northern elites, but also by their repressive response to a labor protest following the abrupt dismissal of 300 southern workers from a textile factory in Nazara, during which 14 protesters were killed by the army. While the mutiny was brutally squashed, it laid the ground for southerners to take up arms against the central government. Now, this massacre in Joda is linked to the outbreak of the First Civil War because striking farmers in Sudan Center were threatening existing capitalist labor relations that allowed ruling elites to extract maximum profits to fund its repressive campaign against Southern resistance fighters. And I highlight this historical moment because it reveals the way state violence in Sudan has for a very long time been shaped by the need to reproduce and maintain an extractive war economy that serves elite interests by any means necessary. This relatively unknown massacre in Kosti allows us to nuance the center-periphery framework a bit by demonstrating that even in the 50s, farmers at the center who were largely spared the brutal state violence that was unleashed against people in the South became subject to it when they revolted against the systems of elite rule that they were at the time cementing. Similarly, the labor protests that took place in Nazara following the dismissal of these 300 textile workers, this labor protest and its violent suppression is one of many examples of popular uprising, organizing, and resistance that preceded, in this case, South Sudanese taking up arms against the central government that remains largely unknown. And this erasure serves, in my view, a particular purpose. To learn more about this history and time, you can read historian Skopas Pogo's work. So this is my long-winded point here, is that we can draw a straight line from the outbreak of the Civil War in 1955, which over the decades and in its two phases killed over 2.5 million, mostly South Sudanese people, to the current war that arrived in the capital Khartoum last April, in the same way that we can draw a straight line between the Nakba of 1948 to the genocidal violence the Israeli state is currently unleashing in occupied Palestine and Lebanon. History as a framework of analysis forces us to not exceptionalize the violence currently engulfing parts of the country in unprecedented ways, but to situate it within this longer history. Specifically, we have to resist this ahistorical, in my view, quite dangerous narrative that the Sudanese army is a benevolent revolutionary force. It never has been, never will be, even if many on the ground view it as the lesser of two evils, which I'm sympathetic to. But the idea that the army will hand over power to civilians after it wins this war is completely delusional. They have only done that once in our long history of military coups, and that was a very different context, right? And so I'm going to end, I just want to briefly say, I think we have to also, I didn't include sort of the 19th century, which I think is a very important time period to understand what's happening in Sudan, especially in terms of the history of slavery and land. But I also want to say that I think we have to resist, and I fall into this trap sometimes myself, of solely pinning the violence and the structural and societal forms it has taken on elites. And that too, of course, has a history. We think about the 70s onwards, how this need to serve Sudanese elite interests by any means necessary manifested itself in the form of a kind of ethno-nationalist, monocultural Arab, increasingly Islamist project being imposed on a multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious country in violent ways under Nimeri and al-Bashir, linking ideology to kind of violent capitalist extraction and dispossession. On the one hand, we had multiplying forms of dissent and organized resistance against this project, which were brutally suppressed through an ever-expanding security apparatus of paramilitary forces, torture houses, prisons, surveillance tactics, etc. And on the other hand, this project also required buy-in from ordinary people who oiled the racist propaganda machine that legitimized and facilitated it. And we saw people themselves marginalized by the state in Darfur and other regions, for instance, get absorbed into the popular defense forces, which was one of the primary instruments of Islamist political and popular mobilization and developed in the war on the South, deployed in the war on the South, or dispossessed farmers and herders in central Sudan being absorbed into NIS, known for its raids and violent crackdowns on protests and dissidents. So I'm just going to end on this. For me, as a student of Marx and Walter Rodney and Fatma Babikir Mahmoud, and as someone invested in a materialist analysis of change, the challenge for me has always been how to talk about elite rule and capitalist exploitation and extraction in Sudan, while also not downplaying race and the often racialized and gendered nature of this extraction and violence. And of course, racial capitalism offers us that framework, but I find myself being quite clumsy, perhaps because of my own positionality and privilege, in providing the empirical evidence for the ways the counter-revolution in Sudan has and always has been a racial capitalist project. So I'll end with that caveat. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yes, great. Thanks, Nisrin, for that. That was, I think, sort of a very masterful synopsis of sort of how we ended up here, and very much the top notes of why we ended up here. I think, two things. One, this conference comes at a very critical time, because one thing that we're seeing very clearly is that with the polarization in the political discourse in Sudan, criticality has gone out of the window. And there are a lot of people who just do not invest the time in doing some of the intellectual lifting that is required to understand this series of crises well enough. And we, all of us, fall into some of these binaries that Nisrin mentioned. We also fall into sometimes dumbing things down for the sake of quick understanding by a variety of different people. But I think we as Sudanese definitely need to do the work to understand this much more critically, much more deeply, because actually, if we lose that, then we'll get pulled into ever more into these binaries and into this polarization, which benefits no one. And I think, just to sort of, the way I think of Sudan's history is, of course, is very cyclical. We all know that. But Sudan has been stuck in two cycles that sort of used to work reasonably interdependently, but quite separately from each other. One is the revolution, transition, coup cycle, and that has happened several times. Nisrin has mentioned 1964, 1985, and of course 2018, 2019. The other is the war mediation, peace process, peace agreement cycle. And the thing that is, I think, worth noting about this particular war is that this is the first time that those two things have converged, that they're happening at effectively the same time. Previously, because of the nature of those wars, very much kept to one part of the country, you had sort of revolution for the center and war in the periphery. And that now is no longer a binary the Sudan has. And so this is, speaking of contradictions, as Bayan asked us to consider, this is both very typical of what came before, but also unprecedented in many ways. And of course, this is the first time that war of this nature has also hit Khartoum first, and hit Khartoum hardest in many ways, at least at the beginning. And this means that the very nature of the state is now up for grabs is the wrong word, but it's very much a high stakes game for the soul of the state in a way that it really never has been before. There are lots of contradictions, I think, that all of us have to live. Some of us are more comfortable with that than others. I think a lot of the political commentary that we see that is very happy to be partisan, that is very happy to live within a very polarized political discourse, does not tolerate much room for some of these contradictions. But I think we all recognize that actually contradictions are not sort of the aberration here. They're absolutely part of this whole piece. And so, for example, the fact that this is very much in line with what came before, very much in line with the different structures, economic, social, political, economic, but also unprecedented, that is a contradiction we have to live with. The fact that you can have, lesser evils, if you will, and still very much understand that they are evils and pretty much understand how they're integral to the way that we got here. That is a contradiction that we all have to live with. And actually, I think it behooves us to keep interrogating that rather than feel discomforted by some of these contradictions. We need to lean into them. And not everybody is willing to do that. And I think actually that is the role of scholars, intellectuals, everyone really. But certainly what I fear is that we are seeing a diminishing of the intellectual space, as a lot of very well-renowned Sudanese scholars and intellectual thinkers are forced to choose a side. That unfortunately puts a strain on people like Nisrin and others to do a lot of that heavy lifting. And I think that the difficulty that we're seeing now is that because this very much follows in history's footsteps, we're potentially looking at a very long conflict. And it's more of sort of this war of attrition that we're seeing. One side gains the upper hand, the other side gains the upper hand. One side starts to fracture, the other side starts to fracture. We see this mirroring along both sides, and we see a lot of sort of hubristic language coming out from the different sides that support them, particularly the civilians, who believe that the end is nigh. And I think that is something that we, this is a place that a lot of us want to live in, because frankly, we all want to see an end to this war. But also history tells us, we could be looking at a 20-year conflict. If we look at the first Sudanese civil war, that was 17, 18 years. The second Sudanese civil war, 22 years. Darfur conflict, 20 years and counting. Sudan doesn't tend to do short wars. And because of the sort of this high stakes nature of this particular conflict, we are unfortunately in what could be year 2 of 20. And if we don't start inculcating the criticality that will be required to really, see this conflict for what it is, I think we'll be far worse off in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years' time. And in a way, of course, that's intentional. What we're seeing is with the way that the war is being waged, not just by the two main parties, but several others, allied or otherwise, is that actually controlling the political discourse is part of this war, is part of every war. But keeping that discourse polarized, keeping people effectively in one camp or the other, rather than holding the center, rather than holding the space for more critical thinking, more intellectual thinking on this, is precisely part of the war effort. If people gather in the center and they call for an end to the war, you can't keep this war going. If you give people a sense that they are the rights, they should be on what is quote unquote the right side of things, regardless of where that is, then you're able to you have a license effectively to keep the war going. And I think there's nowhere that we see that more clearly than, of course, on social media. And there again, that's something that is we didn't have in the first Sudanese civil war or the second Sudanese civil war, and not even in the earlier parts of the Darfur conflict. So it's an extra platform, it's an extra arena of warfare that I think we have to consider. And I think the contradictions that we see there are vastly greater than the contradictions we see elsewhere. I think another dynamic that we need to consider this time round, which was there before too, but this time round has a particular edge, I would say, is the sort of diaspora versus, Sudanese within Sudan dynamic. And it certainly has been very interesting for me to witness the role of diaspora. Traditionally, diaspora was sort of reasonably united in political vision because the motivations that led them to lead were usually against a particular group. So people who left in the early 90s were all against the Islamist regime, and they tended to have similarities in the way that they thought, the way that they conceived of the state of Sudan. That is no longer the case. Sudan has been a country that has produced a lot of waves of migrants, diasporans, etc., that now you get a sort of a constellation of different political opinions within the diaspora as well as inside Sudan. That is something we also need to think about how we engage with. It is not something that we necessarily need to control or anything that we need to manage, but I think the way we engage with those with different diaspora groups is going to be part of the task of figuring out how we get ourselves out of this. But I just want to end by saying that because of the almost totality of the destruction of the Sudanese state, there are two sort of dynamics that I think require, sort of further engagement with. One is, sort of memory of what Sudan people conceive of when they think of Sudan and sort of the sense of nostalgia. And the other is the forgetting and amnesia. So as Nisrin said, the idea that, for example, the Sudanese armed forces could be a force for good, that it would want to hand over revolutionary power to civilians is not something that has been borne out in history. But people forget that quite conveniently because they need a hero. They need somebody they can back. And that, of course, is directly inimical to the idea of liberation and the idea of a non-military state or a civilian state. And when we look at how people sort of remember Sudan and the nostalgia, that Sudan is very specific to them, to their class, to their ethnicity, to their geography. But there's a very clear, I think, political campaign to try and create this nostalgic Sudan, as very universalist nostalgic Sudan, that frankly a lot of people don't see, a lot of people don't remember, a lot of people don't recognize. So we're effectively trying to combat these narratives, a lot of which are quite harmful across many layers, whether it's geographic or whether it's in the imagination or the imaginary, or whether it's something that is, frankly, exists both within the immediate changes that we see and the immediate developments that we see, as well as the longue durée and how this all fits into Sudan's history. So all that is to say, I think we unfortunately can't afford to be complacent at all. Even when we are fighting despair, some of us were in Sudan when the war started, and that's obviously something we also have to contend with. But the task is a very difficult one. And I think the fact that we don't see as much attention on Sudan, on the ramifications of the war in Sudan, is adding to the problem. So I guess what I'm trying to say is thank you for hosting, as I said at the beginning. And I think I really want to see more of these kinds of events, bringing more voices, etc., because I think we really do need to interrogate these things before we settle into very concretized ways of thinking about this war that will not serve any of us.
Thanks, Kholood. Oh, hello. Thanks, Kholood, and thanks, Nisrin. Thank you again to all of the organizers. It's a real, genuine honor and pleasure to be here. And I kind of want to echo both of my previous panelists, gratitude, but also acknowledge the importance of these kinds of conversations. And I actually also wanted to mention another panelist who couldn't be with us today, Saad Hassan, who is, there are many voices of folks that, we wish were in the room, virtually or otherwise. But yeah, I think sort of being in the room is a real honor, and also remembering those who aren't is important. I think the question that Bayan you asked I found fascinating. Why does your work demand a complex, dynamic, and sometimes contradictory analysis of the counter-revolutionary war in Sudan? Partly because it required me to frame what the work I do is. And I'm, unlike many other panelists, I'm not part of an institution. I'm not a political analyst. I'm primarily a storyteller, a writer, a broadcaster, somebody who works in the realm of narrative, in the realm of creating possibility through language and so on. And that can sometimes feel less tangible in a way, compared to, conversations about land and conversations about politics and so on. But actually, I think storytelling and the narrative and the way that we make ourselves legible as Sudan and as Sudanese has been incredibly vital and also contradictory in this war, but also I think in the story of Sudan more generally. And so that's maybe what I want to speak to today, is introducing my work as a project, a personal project. It began probably as a personal project of trying to make Sudan legible to others, because I was always living in a context where Sudan was illegible. But also the question of what does it mean to make Sudan legible? Why do we feel like we have to? How do we, and how do you make something legible that isn't fixed? Because I think we are now more than ever, but have consistently been, a state in flux. But also, I think the thing that kept coming up as I was listening to both Kholood and Nisrin is like, what is the state exactly that we are fighting for? We are fighting for the soul of a state, but the state itself is something that is contested, that is fragile, that was not of our making, that is violent, that is not like, these borders. We are the country that is the most recently divided. Like we split in two, and that's a very recent thing in our history. And and what does that actually mean about the kind of idea of Sudan? What is it? What is the Sudan that we are fighting for? And that, I think, is a fascinating question. And that, I think, is, for me, the question that underlies everything that this war is about. We saw during the December revolution this idea that we are all Darfur, we are all, Sudan is going to be different. And yet there's a challenge in defining what that Sudan is, defining what organizes us, what unites us. And for me, the contradiction is like, who am I to decide what that looks like for all of us, right? There is no single individual that can make that decision. And yet, how do we have that conversation when the very basic needs of food, water, sanitation, etc., shelter are not guaranteed, right? People are fighting for their lives. So how could we have a conversation about what the soul of the nation looks like? But I don't think these things are separate. And that is a challenging and fascinating and complex place to be, especially for those of us in the diaspora, right? Where I spend a lot of my time in the realm of the idea of Sudan. That is disconnected sometimes, I think, from the reality of Sudan. And, speaking of memory and amnesia, the nostalgia that we have for Sudan can also be quite dangerous. Nostalgia is an incredibly potent and sometimes dangerous feeling, right? It can allow for falsehoods. It can allow for fictions. It can allow for all sorts of, a version of the Sudan that was propagandized was that of the Bashir era, Arabized, Islamized Sudan. That was a particular version of a Sudan, but that was also very dangerous and also very exclusionary and also very erasing, actually, of the complexity of language, of music, of diversity, of history, of different religions, of different faiths, of different migration patterns. And so I guess I say all this because I think because this is the question that I sit with often. And I think it's something that's constantly, and I'm looking at the question, complex, dynamic, and contradictory. For me, the idea of Sudan is contradictory and complex and dynamic. And I think also in trying to make Sudan legible to myself and to the outside world, I'm constantly faced by the challenge of trying to fit our story into frameworks from other parts of the world that don't quite fit us, right? Bayan, you mentioned earlier the sort of the binaries of the Arab, the like Black and Arab, the binary of like South and North, the binary of Christian Muslim or Muslim and other faiths. I don't think any of these binaries work for Sudan well. And not only because they're binaries, but because the nature of Sudan, the history of Sudan, the way where it is in the world, the diversity of language and ethnic tribes and so on. All of these mean what we're asking people to do is understand a whole new framework, right? One that they can't just easily shoehorn in, or we can't easily be shoehorned in to other frameworks. And so that in itself is something challenging when people are looking for, say, on social media, a quick, easy, bite-sized understanding, which is what I spend a lot of time doing, trying to sort of do an easy understanding in order to build a coalition of allies and supporters and so on around the world, trying to make people pay attention. It's difficult to resist the urge to say this is a war between two generals, or this is, whatever it might be, the simplified version, because you want something that is easy to remember, that is easy to understand, but also how do you do that without erasing what is actually going on, right? How do you do that without flattening the complexity and the nuance? How do you do that when you yourself are always implicated in whatever it is you're talking about? I am diaspora, I am, born in Khartoum, I am of a particular class. All of these sorts of things do not disappear. We cannot, I think it's very, it's critical that we are also engaged with our positionality as storytellers and people who are interested and advocating for Sudan. So I'm not sure that I completely answered the question, but I think what I speak to is the challenge of telling a story, some of the stories of Sudan, the question I continue to grapple with around the soul of the nation we're fighting for, and also and in some ways also the validity of thinking about these questions when actually it's a humanitarian crisis, and and sometimes I feel like this is a thing that we should worry about later when everyone is safe and fed, but you can't really get there. I think these things don't happen separately. So finding the role that we can play most effectively is maybe what I've been trying to do. Thank you very much.
Hamid, if you're online and able to answer the question.
I'm online. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. It's real, and thank you so much for having me, and greetings to all of you. It's so difficult to go after the brilliant remarks by Nisrin, Kholood, and Yassmin. But yeah, I will do my best, and I think I definitely agree with most of what has been said so far. I think, the issue of Sudan's war and how it's multifaceted, and that there are many truths and dimensions and contradictions that all coexist together, and how it requires a very nuanced analysis and understanding of the war and its causes and its manifestations and so on, is something that the world has not been practicing, when it comes to Sudan. And I think probably not necessarily interested in pursuing when dealing with issues in the global South in general, but I think in Sudan particularly. And I think the case of Sudan is, quite challenging to many, to the world vastly, because, after decades of sanctions during the regime of Omar al-Bashir, that did not only punish the authoritarian regime that was ruling the country at the time, but also collectively punished us as citizens by keeping us outside the global discourse, the global consciousness. No one knew anything about, what is happening in Sudan. And as Sudanese citizens living in Sudan, it was almost impossible to communicate to the world. So after, decades of being isolated and, no one taking interest in learning anything about Sudan, it becomes even more difficult to understand the complexity of this current war. And I think because of, that gap in the history of the country and the analysis of what was happening and so on, people try to understand us and the Sudanese state and the issues within the Sudanese state in relation to other, regional struggles or issues. And for instance, Nisrin spoke about how the December resolution in Sudan, people tend to analyze it in relation to previous revolutions in Sudan in 1964 and 1985. And I think, that's definitely true, but also that is a particular type of people. I think it's mostly the students of Sudan and people who are interested in Sudan and so on. In other kind of contexts, more global contexts and so on, the December Revolution was and still is. I read a lot of publications and hear people who try to understand it as a late Arab Spring revolution, which is, bizarre if you ask me. That Sudan's third successful revolution, and successful by meaning that it overthrew the authoritarian regime at the time in its post-independence history, is understood as a late Arab Spring. So that shows you to what extent, there isn't any nuance in terms of understanding the issues in Sudan. And the problem is also the engagement of particularly international actors in terms of engaging with Sudan. It takes very long to update the frameworks and the blueprints that they're working and engaging in Sudan with. For instance, the Sudanese revolution in December has completely changed the landscape, the political landscape of the country in terms of, the active political actors and the different roles that they play and the different issues at play and so on. Yet today, after the revolution and after the coup and after the ongoing war, we still see many actors trying to approach Sudan with the same understanding of Sudan's political landscape before December 2018, which is, definitely quite problematic. And it takes very long time for the international community and those engaging with Sudan to update, their understanding of Sudan. And speaking of the December revolution and so on, I think everything that, was said about Sudan's history and how you could trace today's war to issues that span back decades and so on, but also issues that are very kind of, contemporary and related to today's history and today's issues and so on. I think the December Revolution project, a beautiful but imperfect, stumbling, frustrating, aspiring, inspiring, contradictory with all these issues and all these kind of adjectives to describe it, was trying to attempt in some ways to dismantle, some of these historical issues and grievances that we have been seeing. And that's why I think part of how I see today's, the war that is ongoing in Sudan at the moment is that it's a manifestation of the failure of the post-colonial Sudanese state project that was, obviously has colonial roots, and then there were Sudanese elites who were trying to champion that project and so on. And I think the December Revolution in some ways challenged that, although not necessarily successfully. But I think this war is a manifestation of the failure of that project in so many ways. And one last point that I would end with, I think, I've been speaking about, shortcomings in terms of international engagement with Sudan and, the lack of nuance, understanding of analysis when it comes to Sudan. But I think also, as was also mentioned just now, I think as Sudanese, there's a lot more that we need to do to engage with our own issues in a more nuanced and critical way. But I think also a part of why we are very different in how we approach Sudan is that Sudanese people have experienced the Sudanese state in very different ways, depending on who they are and where they sit. You know, Sudanese women have a very different relationship with the Sudanese state to Sudanese men. Sudanese citizens of non-Arab ethnic backgrounds have a very different relationship with the state to Sudanese, you know, quote unquote Arab citizens and so on. And I think that all contributes to how we experience, like how we feel about the Sudanese state and what kind of future we see for the Sudanese state and so on. And there is no way that we are going to be able to move forward and to find a solution if we don't manage to find a framework that acknowledges all these experiences and acknowledges that they all matter and that they're all legitimate, and you know, they all should be discussed and should be like thought about when you think about the way forward. Without that, I don't think we'll be able to get out of this. I will end here. Thank you.
I can go ahead next. I assume I'm the person who should be speaking next. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As the speakers have mentioned, I'm really delighted and happy to be here today to take part of this conversation. I think it's timely, it's needed, and I think more of these are needed to unpack the complexities as mentioned by other speakers ahead of me. As briefly mentioned by Bayan at the beginning of this session, my name is Jawhratelkmal Kanu, and I come from an economics background. And in my attempt to answer the question of why do I think a more kind of contradictory or complex analysis of the work that I do is needed in order to take it forward, I'll try and take us back at least a few years ago when I started noticing a few things that have shifted if I may say, the dimensions of my work. So as an economist that has been mostly focused on numbers, on the economic performance indicators and so on, I've started noticing dynamics in different parts of the country, Sudan, that were not necessarily bound by economic performance and so on. So, for example, in my hometown of Al-Fashir, which is the second largest in the Darfur region, and of course has been a historical capital of the region, I couldn't help but to notice the change in the ways people were making a living. Of course, the 20 years of the war in the region have shifted many things. The town was a host to hundreds of thousands of refugees that found themselves in the city. They're now an integral part of the city. They've been living there for more than 10 years. Some of the younger people that are now grown adults have been born in the camps around the city and so on. And these people come from a different kind of way of making living. Al-Fashir itself being somewhat an urban center, has for years witnessed certain ways of making living, like trade, like being part of the civic service and so on. But the newcomers came with new ideas of entrepreneurship, with new ideas of making a living, if I may say, dynamism to the existing static life of Al-Fashir. And I think this has changed many things. We've seen how some neighborhoods were being established. We've seen how some big amounts of cash being traded inside and outside of the city and so on. But there was also another layer of the economy that was evident and growing. One side of it was related to the massive surge of the international actors and workers that were coming to the town because of the different conflicts around it and in the region. Since 2003, we've seen how some new houses were being built for INGOs, for UN agencies, for AU-related kind of missions and so on. And we've also seen how these new forces have pumped so much cash in town, and this has allowed the economy to move in a certain direction. I will specifically get back to this point because this is something that we also see repeated now in the current war. There was also another element related to the informal economy or a black market economy kind of thing. Of course, Al-Fashir or the Darfur region is bordering Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, and lately South Sudan. So being in the border of different countries, and most of us know, borders of Sudan are not necessarily strict borders. Most of the time it's easy to move because of the tribal linkages or just because the border is too long and there isn't much control there. And over the years, this has been trade routes for different groups. So now the new phenomena has included transporting cars, transporting goods, transporting weapons, everything to and from the region, and this has also caused a surge in the local markets in these areas. Me personally, for example, I wouldn't be surprised, but it was somewhat odd to me when I go there and I see that most of the houses have like Italian or European kind of equipment in the houses that are coming from the border through Libya, for example, or you find things that have some French origin coming through Chad, and so on and so forth. So it was an open market that was getting things from different neighboring countries, and of course, this was a two-way kind of trade, whereby people take things from Sudan to other countries and from other countries to Sudan and so on. This trade was not just risky in terms of the routes and so on, but it was risky because it was hand in hand with other dangerous trades like arms trade, like mercenarism, like all the kinds of illegal trades and so on. My point is just this simple observation of the way of how livelihoods have changed in this particular incident or in this particular town has made me ask myself, like, is it just about new amounts of people coming to town, or is it a complete shift in the way people were looking at making a living? Historically, it has always been either been a farmer, either been a member of a pastoralist community, a civil servant if you're in an urban center, or a trader. But now all these new dynamics have been changing things away from this very limited kind of understanding of economic behavior, and so on. This, of course, has its own manifestations in different terms. For example, younger people were not very much happy about just being dragged into one of the traditional sectors. People wanted to make money because other sectors had more money. The risk was higher, but they were able to make money. It also changed the dynamics of decision making. It's not just about like all their civil servants that had the power and authority. It was more about who has more money and who had more connections in different parts and was able to move bigger sums of finances faster and so on. This was, of course, before the revolution, all these observations. And the reason why I recall this particular example, because I think there is a need for us to go beyond the binary understanding of either revolution or counter-revolution. There are different dynamics in different parts. As Nisrin mentioned earlier, in different parts of Sudan, there have been a timeline of incidences before the revolution that has shaped what has been happening today. This applies for the region of Darfur. This applies for other things. For example, the first revolution in Darfur in modern Sudan's history or post-independence was in 1957. So if we start from that point of time, we can see how things have been accumulating and shifting the narratives today. So even when we look at the 2019 revolution in Darfur, it's not the same accumulation that has been happening in different areas. Hence, it requires for a more robust analysis of what's been happening. Fast forward, I continue to research the war and the economy in the current war, in the current April 15th war. And similarly, there have been new trends whereby, of course, at the end of the day, people are resilient. They always find ways to make a living, even if the situations are dire, in waiting for aid and so on. Not always successful for everyone, but there have been new trends in the current war, just like in previous incidences. For example, the example I've mentioned earlier about the prices of real estate, about new buildings rising in some of the areas and so on. This is being repeated in Port Sudan, for example. Port Sudan have been witnessing all these kind of phenomena whereby the prices are very high because there is high demand from NGOs, there is high demand from international workers. There is also a rise in construction because there is a market for this kind of things and so on. And this shifts the way people look at war as a source of making a living rather than its other disadvantages and so on. In a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that for me, if I try and understand the dynamics of the economy in a wartime, I can't just look at the inflation or the GDP or the amount of exports we're doing. I also look at the human behavior and how it has been shifted or how it has been forced to shift to match these areas. In a normal situation, I think people wouldn't choose to go through these dangerous or high-risk kind of activities. But I think the situation of war just opens the rooms, the door for this kind of behaviors and so on. Nonetheless, I think beyond the economy, we need to move away from, and this has been mentioned by other speakers, we need to move away from like this mutual exclusivity of narratives. Like, for example, if I believe that the Sudanese state hasn't been fair since its establishment in 1956 or even before that, that does not mean I necessarily support demolishing everything and starting over. It might be true that the state hasn't been very fair and we need to work on it and so on. And this goes the other direction as well. If I believe that that a group of people has been historically marginalized, they have the right to access services, they've been weaponized by the existing government in Khartoum and so on, namely pastoral communities or nomadic communities and so on, that does not mean I support the narrative that says let's just destroy them all and get rid of them and they're not Sudanese and these kind of things. So I think as people who are trying to understand the current phenomena in Sudan, or at least trying to get an idea of what's happening, these mutually exclusive narratives wouldn't work, number one. And number two, I think it's important to go beyond the slogans. For example, I think it was Yassmin. Yeah, Yassmin earlier, she's mentioned some of the revolutionary slogans about, like, we're all Darfur, we're all this and that. And I think this has been one of the things that have been somewhat limiting us from going beyond. We all agree that the revolutionary slogans were very strong. We were all gathering around them. But I think maybe now is the time that we go beyond the slogans and we see what it means for us to implement them on the ground. For example, the moment that people found themselves in the face of the others that they claim to be standing with before, it was a bit difficult to make the choice now, because it's now your life or the other person's life. And it's not an easy choice, of course. But I think maybe now is the time for us to go deeper, look into these issues. And yeah, I agree. Maybe this is not the highest priority, but I think things don't happen separately, and we need to at least start looking and having these conversations now as this war is being fought. Thank you.